Peak Sword, 16th in the unified rankings with 8 top members and 200 Silver Knight Guild elites, gathers to assault a boss monster that only ever appears rarely, the Helgao. The last 5 attempts to hunt the boss were all failures, so they're truly going all out this time. Even with all of their preparations, Peak Sword still isn't confident. 3 minutes before the start of the raid, they spot a cloaked stranger at the other end of the boss cavern. How could the person have gotten past all of their guards, and why would he do such a thing? His user ID, Grid, turns up no results, which means he at least isn't a ranker. Feeling comforted by Grid's lack of status, Peak Sword confronts Grid and threatens him with violence if he doesn't leave. Grid, unfazed by the insults, tosses aside his cloak and reveals the suit of extremely high-end armor he's wearing just before the Helgao attacks the lot of them. The Silver Knight Guild loses half of its members to one of the boss's fire attacks, but Grid remains completely unharmed, only stopping briefly to tell Peak Sword to do something about the boss because it's making things too hot. Peak Sword only has one question for Grid though. How could he still be standing after everything the boss is throwing at him? Grid smiles and replies, he's simply overgeared. His path to becoming overgeared starts as he's chased by a group that wounds him and warns him about his own greed. Asher, the one responsible for the hunt, lets him know that the reward for his service is death. It took Grid months to pursue the quest. Is it really going to end like this? He laments the game, Satisfy, the world's greatest virtual reality game. It has over 2 billion players around the world and can even be called another Earth. Even with a massive player base, most of the land is still unexplored, and the place that led to Grid being hunted was a certain unexplored area, the Northern End Cave. The deepest area of the cave was filled with battle gear piled up in a mountain. An hour prior to being hunted, Grid, a level 73 warrior, discovered the S-grade quest item for Earl Asher, the legendary craftsman's book. The S-grade quest took him months of effort and resulted in the loss of many levels, potions, and pieces of equipment, but his efforts all paid off in the end. He plans to get the Sun Sword reward and never talk to Asher again. Despite all of his effort, he still can't use the book until he purchases an appraisal item from the in-game store for $410. The cost is daunting, but Grid goes through with the purchase anyway. After all, couldn't he just make more money with the rewards? Grid uses the appraisal item and the legendary craftsman's book turns into Pagma's rare book. The book is described as a tome of the master blacksmith Pagma's techniques. If he opens the book, he can change his class to Pagma's descendant. With the ranking of legendary, it's a unique class that can't be obtained through any other method. Though the thought of using it passes through his mind, Grid is more enticed by the idea of clearing the quest and selling it to pay for school and living expenses. He finalizes his decision to sell it and tries to log out, only to be met with the message that he can't end the game yet. His quest, Earl Asher's secret request, changes to Earl Asher's anger, and the Earl appears with his allies. Just before the finishing blow hits him, Grid uses every technique he can think of to fight the Earl's minions, but he's simply no match for them. Since he'll lose the book if he dies anyway, Grid activates it and takes the legendary class. Grid feels hope from the surge of power he feels, and he raises his weapon to confront the Earl's soldiers with his new legendary class. He doesn't realize it yet, but his level was reset to 1 as part of the class change, and most of his equipment was unequipped. In the end, Grid dies. Back in the real world, the company that runs Satisfy reports on a user's acquisition of a legendary class. Since he was already level 1, Grid's level is reduced to -1 from the death and quest failure penalties, and he's logged out to wait for the death timer. He sits up from his gaming capsule, saddened by the loss of all the money he could have gained from selling the book. Within the SA group, within the building for the developers of Satisfy, CEO Lim Cholho goes over Grid's information with Choi Nahi, the head of Satisfy's operations team. Grid is shown to be a largely unremarkable user with achievements such as staying in the same city for a year to raise his reputation, and playing in a level 200 area for 3 months while dying countless times. Nahi wants to write it off as pure luck, but Cholho views luck and tenacity as good traits. Originally, the supercomputer Morpheus and the development team predicted the legendary class book would be discovered within 2 years, but Grid, through his sheer luck and tenacity long past where most would have given up, broke those predictions and made it through the entire questline to get the book. What's even more lucky is that Grid dropped to level 1 as an extreme side effect of gaining a legendary class, and since the penalty for failing a class is losing 2 levels, Grid managed to be the only user to hit level -1. With 2 levels required to hit level 1 again and 10 stat points per level, Grid will essentially be always 20 stat points higher than the other users of his level. Could that really all just be luck? Back in an office, Grid, whose real name is Youngwoo, collects money for completing a job and sits on a bench with the night sky overhead. He lost his beloved levels, has just enough money to pay for the game, and has to pretty much start again, but he still hasn't given up. The CEO thinks about how unremarkable Grid is in every other aspect. But will Grid be able to overcome that with tenacity? Youngwoo sits in his gaming pod and re-enters the game to find himself in an unfamiliar location upon reviving. Since he was banished from the town for failing to complete the quest and betraying the Earl, Grid tries to find a landmark to pinpoint his location and stumbles upon a high-level dungeon, the Yatan Temple, where he sees cultists preparing to sacrifice a woman on the altar. He looks over his legendary class options and sees the options aren't too bad. He can already think of a way to make money, and he's able to equip any item regardless of restrictions, though with the possibility of there being penalties. He equips a greatsword and armor that would usually require the user to be level 60 and receives penalties ranging from 20 to 50%, which is still better than not being able to use the items at all. He starts to feel how amazing this class is with the unrestricted equipping of items, but level 60 gear simply isn't going to cut it in a level 150 dungeon. The dungeon is simply too much for him, and Grid prepares to leave when a man surprises him and introduces himself as Doran, Earlsteim's secret bodyguard. Doran explains the situation. Earlsteim's daughter, Irene, was kidnapped during Doran's vacation and is being used as a sacrifice by the cultists. Another quest activates, an S-grade quest to rescue Irene within an hour. Doran, who's revealed to be an NPC due to being able to give a quest, mistakes Grid's lack of a fear effect for being powerful when it's really just thanks to another one of his class characteristics. He refuses to help, but Doran continues to plead with him in every way he can think of while Grid continues to reject the quest until he ends up knocking over a large rock on his slow retreat from the cave that lands on and kills a cultist. Having killed one of the cultists, even accidentally, causes the quest to be accepted. A large swarm of enemies charge at them, and Grid is left with the task of rescuing Irene while Doran clears the way. Not only are the cultists high-level enemies, but Grid is also only level -1. Even with his level 60 gear, just a single glancing blow is enough to kill him. Luckily, Doran proves to be extremely skilled and fights through the cultists. More cultists appear, and Doran takes Grid down to rescue Irene, misunderstanding him at every turn and believing him to be just humble and extremely powerful still. The cultists start a black magic chant, but Doran leaps into their group and interrupts them. Just when Grid starts to believe Doran can clear the quest himself, the cultists finish their chanting and subdue the helpful NPC. The cultists believe they've won, but Doran activates a special skill to release himself from the dark magic and continues to assault the cultists until he's stopped by a user, Yura, whose quest is to defend the sacrifice. Known as the Blood Witch, Yura is a famous Korean player consistently ranked 1st in the Black Magician rankings and 5th in the Unified rankings. Why would she, a user known for excellent senses and control, be there? She sees Grid's items and misidentifies him as a level 80, which still wouldn't make him much of a threat, and he tries to tell her how hard it'll be for her to take down Doran. How could Grid possibly overcome the level gap between himself, a level -1, and Yura, a world ranker at level 230? Doran continues his attack, and Yura uses her trump skill to trap him before beginning to absorb his blood. All hope seems lost, but Doran's equipment skill activates again and frees him from her attack. Doran and Yura continue to fight, and more cultists arrive to back her up. She's given a moment by the appearance of the cultists and thinks about how pathetic Grid is before using her ultimate skill, Dark Storm. Before the attack can finish Doran off, Grid runs into its path, and a flurry of debris and smoke is kicked up by the explosion. Yura, believing the fight is done, is shocked when the dust clears and Grid stands there, looking unscathed and a bit confused. Her thoughts race. How could she have not known about such an amazing user? Just who is Grid? Grid looks at his HP, which stays frozen at 1. He still hasn't properly looked at his class characteristics and sees that there is an effect that gives him 5 seconds of invulnerability after he hits 1 HP. Doran leaps off of Grid's back and charges in again, and Yura, believing Grid to be a threat now, defends herself and launches a spell in his direction, only to see that nobody is there. Did he log out? As it turns out, Doran's leap off of Grid's back did 1 damage to him and killed him. He sits up in his gaming pod, having dropped by another 2 levels to -3 and being given a 12-hour lockout timer for the game for having died twice in 24 hours. Still in the game, Yura mistakes it as Grid feeling pity for her and handing her the quest. She swears vengeance, and Grid is even given a nickname the next day in the community, Ghost of the Yatan Temple. Youngwoo rages at Doran killing him and Yura's appearance in the quest, and he takes his revenge by posting troll posts about Yura on the game's forum. As he's doing so, his younger sister enters the room and starts nagging him about cleaning the place and taking a shower. She asks about him earning money in the game before seeing the kind of posts her brother was writing and leaving in disappointment. The next morning, Youngwoo watches the channel dedicated to Satisfy and sees the reporter talking about the Yatan Temple, which collapsed after he died. Unknown to them during their battle, a third player was watching them fight, and he reports on Yura using her skills to attack someone. When the witness reports that Grid took her ultimate attack and remained unscathed, the reporter gets excited and believes it could have been a rancor, but the witness's account ends there because a boulder fell and crushed him. It may be a case of misunderstanding, but Youngwoo finds out he's famous, though nobody has identified him yet. Upon realizing he's famous, Youngwoo's first thought is of the money he can gain. Youngwoo immediately goes for the phone and calls the news center, telling them that he was the one in the temple and answering their questions about his name and level. Of course, who would possibly believe an unknown user at level -3 could fight Yura? They hang up on him, and Youngwoo watches the final replay they had of the battle with the ruins crumbling around Doran and Irene. The news switches to the next story and introduces Katz, a unified ranker known for being a jerk who's the son of a big corporation CEO. Katz revealed that he somehow gained 30 levels in 3 months when it took Youngwoo years to get to level 70 and broadcasts a warning to Yura that he'll be the one to reach first in the unified ranking. He reveals his secret, an epic class he gained that drastically increased his hunting speed due to a skill that lets him absorb HP from enemies. Youngwoo's death timer ends, and he logs back into the game and appears in the town where he was during Asher's quest before. Everyone around him is recruiting level 100 plus users for quests, so Grid decided to head to a better town. But since the cost is 10 gold and he only has 3, he finds himself stuck. Of course, the easiest way for him to get gold would probably be for him to use his legendary smithing class. Grid goes through his class characteristics and starts the unique construction of a weapon by designating the materials to be used and describing the weapon. Grid goes completely overboard with the description, and the system ends up autocorrecting the weapon shape and stats to create the closest equivalent. The weapon's restrictions prove to be incredibly high, requiring level 300 when the highest level user is only level 250. Still though, since he can ignore the equipment restrictions, he can at least use it if he can get the materials to make it. His new plan is to join the party doing the Guardian of the Forest quest and leech off of them while collecting the materials he needs for the weapon. When he goes to join the party, they immediately turn him away due to his equipment. He tries to lie about his level and say that he has skills to join them, but they suspect him right away. Before he's fully rejected, Regis, the first ranked martial artist known as the Taekwon Master, tells them that one more player to help clear the trash mobs while they assault the boss couldn't hurt. The rest of the party seems hesitant, but Regis proposes a 1v1 match with Grid to test his abilities. Grid, of course, doesn't stand a chance. The rest of the party thinks it's a great idea, but Grid backs out and walks away quickly, leaving Regis confused and a bit disappointed. He resolves to just get the money for the carriage first when a message prompts him to name the item he created. What better name for his first blueprint creation than Failure? Grid tries selling the blueprint to a blacksmith, but he's turned away. With his options exhausted, he starts to lose hope, and the blacksmith takes some pity on him and tells him to chop firewood for experience and money. Due to his negative level, the experience gained from chopping logs alone is more than enough to level up. Before getting back to chopping wood, Grid examines the axe and gains a 100% understanding of it on the first try due to his class. With 100% understanding, an outline appears on the log where he needs to hit. Unfortunately, he still has the stats of a level -3 and only manages 150 logs in 2 hours. He persists anyway and fights through his exhaustion to cut more logs, being rewarded with a legendary specific stat, Persistence, in the process. 4 more hours pass and Grid shows the blacksmith the results, 1,000 chopped logs in a total of 6 hours. The blacksmith doesn't believe Grid when he claims he's also a blacksmith, so he gives him a quest to prove himself by mining 80 iron ore. The quest gives just enough experience to get him back to level 0, so Grid happily takes it. Again, using his class characteristics to gain understanding of his tool, a pickaxe, Grid ignores the judging comments and looks of the other miners and gets to work, still wearing his full armor and suffering weight and movement penalties. Time passes, and night arrives as Grid finishes mining 170 ore and reaches level 1 through his persistence. With reaching level 1, Grid's stats are returned to their normal states and he gains the effects of his class's basic stat values as well. His legendary class truly starts to reveal his power here, and he has 182 total stats where a normal level 1 would have 22. And he also discovered his 40 stat points from going through negative levels. The blacksmith praises Grid and gives him advice on his first blueprint to make, Jaffa arrows that penetrate enemy defenses. Grid doesn't gain 100% understanding from just examining the arrow, but the blacksmith explains how to make the item, and Grid uses the assisting effects of his legendary blacksmith class to create the metal required for the arrows, and hits level 2 in the process. The blacksmith further explains how to make the arrowheads themselves, and Grid reaches a 100% understanding. He shocks the blacksmith when he even goes so far as to temper the arrows while thinking that he can get more money for them the better he makes them. As he finishes, a new skill activates, Legendary Blacksmith's Breath. The skill increases the stats of crafted items by 5% and has a chance to add special features as well, and Grid's arrows end up being epic rarity. Grid receives +4 to every stat, 300 experience, and reputation throughout the continent for completing the epic item. He heads out with his completed arrows to sell them in the town with a new outlook on his class, eager to make more items to sell to users in the future. Meanwhile, the Guardian of the Forest raid goes on. The group that Grid previously tried to join, the Sadaka Guild Party, manages to take down the boss, though they suffer heavy losses during the fight and the boss doesn't drop the item they need. In the end, they loot 30 black iron ore, 7 orichalcum ore, and 1 blue orichalcum ore. The fight had lasted the entire day and resulted in 75 deaths. It may have been a part of an S-grade linked quest, but they didn't expect it to be so hard. Back in the village, the group discusses their lack of progress and falling interest in the Guardian of the Forest raid. The group is composed solely of high rankers, but is also low in fame due to its small size. Since they're so low in number, they have to supplement their group with normal users during raids, which has its limits. If they can't loot the item they need, the Amethyst Shield, they can't continue the linked quest. They decide to focus on each gaining at least 15 levels and meeting up again for the raid in 3 months. And the guild leader, Jashuka, stops at a shop to resupply her Jaffa arrows. Grid's arrows catch her eye at first due to how they're triple the price of the other arrows, but their epic grade status quickly nullifies her concerns. She resolves to get her hands on them while wondering who could have possibly made such a thing. Such arrows could even affect the outcome of high-level fights, let alone a boss raid. Could it be possible for a new blacksmith to surpass the best-known blacksmiths? The cheat-like effects on the arrows suggest that it may be true. We hope you enjoyed the story so far. Be sure to check out Overgeared to see what happens next and Grid's journey to fulfilling his role as a legendary blacksmith.